The road stretched endlessly before Daniel, winding through the hills, a forgotten thread. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he exhaled slowly. The air in the car was heavy, the scent of worn leather and dust clinging to the fabric of his jacket. The old sedan rattled as he drove, its engine struggling against the incline. He had been driving for hours, following a road that seemed to stretch forever, his path carved through dense forests and rolling hills, leading him farther from the world he once knew. The weight of exhaustion pressed against his eyelids, but he couldn't stop now. His life in the city had crumbled beneath him like a sandcastle caught in the tide. No job, no savings, and now, no home. Everything had slipped through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but a rusted car, a few crumpled bills in his pocket, and a map he had found in a book at a roadside diner. The map was old, its edges frayed and yellowed with time, but what caught his attention was the red circle drawn around a name: Ravenshade, a town he had never heard of, marked as if it held some kind of significance. There were no details, no notes scribbled in the margins, only that bold red circle, as if someone had wanted to remember, or perhaps, to warn. As he neared the outskirts of the town, something felt off. The air grew heavier, thick with a stillness that made his skin crawl. The trees lining the road seemed taller here, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. The sunlight dimmed, swallowed by a mist that curled through the streets like ghostly tendrils. Then he saw the *** welcome to Ravenshade *** sign. The letters were worn, faded by time, but what unsettled him most was the bottom half of the sign. It had been scratched away, deep gouges in the wood as if someone had desperately tried to erase whatever was once written there. He hesitated before driving deeper into the town. The streets were empty, not just quiet abandoned. Houses stood with their windows dark, their doors closed, their yards untouched by time or care. There were no children playing, no distant chatter, not even the hum of insects. The silence was unnatural, pressing against his ears like an unseen force. His car rolled to a stop in front of what looked like an inn, its sign swinging gently in the breeze, the wood creaking as if whispering secrets to itself. Stepping out of the car, he felt an odd sensation wash over him. It was as if the town itself was watching, waiting. He shook off the thought and pushed open the door to the inn. A soft chime echoed through the empty space as he entered. The air inside smelled of aged wood and something faintly metallic, like rusted iron. An elderly woman stood behind the counter, her eyes shadowed with something unreadable. She seemed startled by his presence, her fingers twitching slightly as she reached for a key. Her hands trembled as she slid it across the counter. There was something in her expression, something unspoken that lingered in the space between them. A warning, perhaps. But she said nothing more. Daniel took the key and made his way to his room. The hallway stretched before him, dimly lit, the wooden floors groaning beneath his steps. The room itself was small but clean, the window overlooking the empty street below. As the sun dipped beyond the horizon, a deep stillness settled over the town. From his balcony, he watched as the last traces of light disappeared, swallowed by the creeping darkness. Doors locked, curtains pulled shut, the entire town retreating into silence. It was as if the place had gone to sleep all at once, leaving him the sole witness to its eerie transformation. Then, as the last sliver of daylight faded, he heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, drifting through the air like a breath against his ear. He froze, his pulse quickening. The sound was not the wind, nor the creak of old wood. It was a voice, a whisper, threading through the silence, calling to him. He turned, scanning the room, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, closer this time, slipping through the walls like a shadow unseen. Then came the knocking, soft at first, then urgent, a sharp, rhythmic sound against the wooden door. He stiffened, his breath caught in his throat. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed felt heavier, pressing against his chest. Then, from the hallway, footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing just outside his door. The air in the room thickened, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The whispers returned, curling through the darkness, slipping through the cracks. They were layered, multiple voices speaking in hushed tones, their words just beyond his understanding. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing them away, but the presence lingered, unseen but undeniable. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It was impossible to tell. The whispers faded, the footsteps ceased, and the oppressive stillness returned. Sleep never came, only the steady thrum of unease that followed him into the hollow hours of the night. When the first sliver of dawn broke through the window, the tension in the air dissipated as if it had never existed. Yet something had changed. The silence no longer felt passive, it felt expectant, as if the town was waiting. Daniel stepped outside, the streets just as empty as before. The mist still clung to the ground, swirling around his feet as he walked. He needed answers. He made his way to the only other building that looked remotely active, a small store at the end of the street. Inside, shelves lined with dust-covered goods stood untouched, their labels faded. Behind the counter sat an old man, his wrinkled hands folded neatly in front of him, his eyes distant.
The man did not react when Daniel asked about the whispers. He did not flinch when Daniel mentioned the knocking, the voices. Instead, he simply reached beneath the counter, pulling out a small wooden sign covered in dust. He set it down gently before Daniel, as if the act itself carried a great weight. The words carved into the wood sent ice through Daniel's veins. Do not speak after dark. Do not open the door. If they call your name, do not answer. It was not a warning. It was a rule, one that had existed for far longer than Daniel could understand. That night, as darkness fell, the whispers returned. But this time, they were different. They no longer simply called his name. They begged, pleaded, cried. Voices of men and women, of children, of people who sounded desperate, lost, terrified. The knocking grew louder, the footsteps more frantic. And then, just beyond the door, a sound. Not a whisper, not a knock, a breath, slow and deep, as if something was standing there, waiting for him to answer. The air turned ice cold. The door handle twisted. The whispers stopped. The town was no longer just watching. It was reaching for him. And Daniel was no longer sure if he would make it to the morning.